Good afternoon, everybody, and happy 420, though that will have nothing to do with the subject of this video. This is Dr. Ken Knight at the Paragon Counselor, and today I want to talk to you guys about anxiety, how to recognize it, how to address it, how to track the results to make sure that you're addressing it correctly and effectively and efficiently. Last video I put out was about how to summarize your emotional state into one of four main directions, and almost an algebra quadrant way of thinking about it, where you've got normal, happy, satisfied, where your feel good chemicals and your feel bad chemicals were aligned. You have depressed, anhedonic, fatigue, sluggish, where your feel good chemicals are too low. You've got mania, impulsivity, where your good and bad are both too high. And then you've got agitation, tension, stress, fear, anxiety, anger, where your stress chemicals or feel bad chemicals are too high. And that's where we're going to focus our attention in this video today, which is how do I recognize this? What mixed or incorrect or ineffective messaging am I getting about how to recognize and address this? And what are the best ways that I could address this in the short and long term? And how do I know it's working? Okay. So this isn't going to be polished. I'm just going to go through some vague points. I've got a vague outline here of the main ideas I want to cover, but as ideas come to me, I'm going to sort of weave them in. And my hope for you is that if you're patient, you sit through this, you should be able to identify, address, and track the sources of and reactions to stress, fear, threat, panic, etc., anger, irritability, all of that. I'm not going to say that if you do everything optimally, you won't experience these things, but the idea is the point of time between recognizing the experience, executing effective action, noticing an improvement, we're hopefully dealing with a much shorter span of time between recognition, action, resolution, okay? And these, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between short and long term. The short-term chemical manipulation tactics are different than the long-term habit formation tactics and strategies to help prevent the intensity of this stuff in the future, okay? And another note here is that, this is assuming a normative biochemical state. This is assuming that someone isn't enduring a medical issue or abusive scenario or extreme external lifestyle. This cannot be taken for medical advice. If you are experiencing this in a clinically significant way, just like all mental health or medical disorders, please see a qualified and local healthcare professional. This is meant to inform, not to replace detailed clinical intervention. Okay. So that being said, let's get to it. Enough preamble. What is anxiety? Okay. And again, just like I said last video, when we throw these words on things, they can mean what people kind of picture them to mean, okay? So when I look up definitions for anxiety, you see that anxiety is a reaction to a perceived or real stress, fear, challenge, or threat in some biopsychosocial domain, okay? And I think that's a perfectly adequate, if vague, definition. And so what that means is when you're experiencing stress chemistry, that's your brain and body's attempt to get you ready to deal with it. Whether or not it's something you can deal with, whether or not it's something you should deal with, or whether or not it's something you should even recognize as something that needs to be dealt with, that's a different story, right? Remember that your brain is a supercomputer wired to hunter-gatherer survival and reproduction activity in small group context, okay? So the triggers for stress, fear, panic, threat, challenge are geared to that lifestyle, so they're not perfectly calibrated to the optimal recognition and reaction to threats as they present themselves in the modern world, okay? So that is the definition, and I just sort of gave how, its purpose a little bit and how it isn't always perfectly expressed in modern context in post-industrial digital information age kind of lifestyles, right? Now, some misconceptions about anxiety is, one is that the presence of stress and anxiety is considered an abnormality, or, its very presence indicates disorder, that there's something wrong with the person experiencing it, and that it is a problem that is indicative that the person experiencing it is doing something wrong. Okay, I would like to disagree with that notion heavily. Okay, so if someone is experiencing anxiety, in the vast majority of cases, there's nothing mechanically wrong with them. It's probably a combination of their lifestyle triggers and the habits they've built for themselves over how they've engaged with those lifestyle triggers through their life up to this point. Okay, I'm going to do another video on cognition and habituation and the way that neurons form habits through myelination. But for today, let's just say that every 10 to 50,000 repetitions, it differs by whatever iterative study comes out, that what you have thought that much or what you have done that many times becomes cemented and habituated and takes a lot less energy than something that's unfamiliar, new, or difficult. Okay, and if you've been like most, I would dare to say that the vast majority of people have higher than healthy levels of stress in at least some points in their lives. And if you haven't been actively countering that through cognitive and physical techniques, then what's going to happen is, just by virtue of obeying the stimulus reaction cause and effect protocol, over time, you're going to sensitize yourself to being very obedient to and very receptive to the perception of stress through an increase in those chemicals. Okay, and what that means is you're going to perceive it to be very important. You're going to be very distressed by the presence of these chemicals, and it's going to be a priority that crowds up a large portion of your present state cognition. Okay, and that makes perfect sense in the evolutionary context where you had to hunt and fish and gather and fight and build for a living. But a lot of our stress triggers today cannot be solved with a thrown spear or a built teepee or a milked cow or a tree fort or whatever. Many of our stressors are very long-term problem solution loops. So if you have debt, if you have problematic family relationships, if you dislike your job, if you dislike your area, if you have chronic health conditions, if you're experiencing abuse, if you've had a negative upbringing, all of these things you have to solve for tens of thousands of repetitions in the cognitive arena, and then you also have to make very gradual, iterative changes in your outside lifestyle, to where in the best case scenario, it's going to be a long time before those external triggers and those habits of responding to external triggers or creating them go away. So there's no immediate benefit to most people having short-term stress reactions to long-term gradual problems. Okay, so that's where we run into this disconnect where your body and brain are built to live in nature, and in reality, we're living in highly regulated, highly tracked, highly archived, long-term planning, thinking, long-term rumination type activities, such as finance, such as employment, such as academia, entrepreneurship, long-term relationships, long-distance relationships, be those professional or personal. And if you have not conditioned yourself away from obedience to your short-term stressors, they're going to deal you a large toll of misery that you can't solve externally the way you could if you lived in a hunter-gatherer context. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the mechanisms and the stress chemistry. Whenever we go biomechanical, we could always go deeper, and there may be some quibble about some of the details, but I'm going to try and keep it more practical than academic while still being obedient to the mechanical realities. Okay, so when you think of an emotion, it's just like last video we said, it's a level of feel good chemicals, reward chemicals, to a level of stress, agitation, and emergency response chemicals. So on one layer, what you're dealing with is a chemical reaction, and when you're stressed out, agitated, irritable, angry, your perception of a threat, real or imagined, threat, fear, challenge, problem, creates a chemical cascade that dampens the front of your brain, causes less control in the front, causes more limbic system activation, that's the middle of the brain, and then it creates a cascade of biological effects south of the neck through sympathetic nervous system activation, and your core organs become more active, your blood pumps higher, you release more testosterone, adrenaline, other norepinephrine in short case. And if it's to prepare you for long-term stressors that you can't immediately solve, you get a lot of chronic stress chemicals, cortisol, glutamate, NMDA. And so without getting into a lengthy biochemistry session, when you are experienced anxiety, stress, fear, panic, agitation, your stress chemistry is too high, your body is geared to shut off its long-term thinking and to activate its emergency protocols. And one of the most important things that happens is prioritization of here and now and detriment of future recovery, repair, growth, and sustainability. Okay? So if you had a realistic reason to be afraid, such as in a natural context, predator, enemy tribe, starvation, what have you, then it's a worthwhile trade-off to experience, say, a couple hours of preparatory chronic stress, cortisol, glutamate, light up your sensory awareness, increase your blood flow, increase your sympathetic nervous system activation, so that you can be alert and ready. And then when the actual threat emerges or the opportunity emerges, you either put down that threat or you hunt that meal with an activation of acute stress chemicals. And then when it's over, your body goes into repair, recover, relax, process, reflect mode. And that's where the resources and the signals shift away from your sympathetic nervous system and towards your parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? And there's all sorts of cues for this, and we'll get into that when we get into the mechanical techniques. But what happens in the modern context is your sympathetic nervous system is too active too often, and the chronic stress chemicals are activated for too small of events, too often, for too long, and in scenarios where no physical action in the immediate circumstance can solve the problem. So instead of a scenario where you're meant to have a brief ramp-up period to prepare you, followed by an even more brief explosive movement solution, followed by a come down, catharsis, relaxation, repeative cycle, we now have a modern context where it's chronic, extensive, exhaustive, preparatory anxiety with no easy culmination of explosive action, which leads to disrupted recharge, reset, and reprioritization of parasympathetic processes, which leads to chronic fatigue, agitation, anxiety. And to get through that, you have to burn off your reward chemicals to just drive on and push through. And if you can't solve the situation and you can't rewire the way you perceive things through your thinking habits, and you're going to experience a sort of low-grade persistent misery that, because you haven't trained yourself endogenously to overcome, you're at the mercy of your external circumstances to allow you out of that human stress response loop. And a lot of people don't really get that relief for, who knows what length of time, but off and on at rapid cycling or extended cycling for years and decades. And I think the result of that is evident in our healthcare costs. It's evident in the suicide rates. It's evident in the trauma rates. Any statistical search about correlation between reported happiness and, competition, debt, industrialization. There's a lot of good that's come from high technology and population growth and interconnectivity, but we certainly have an epidemic of stress that's been way out of hand for way too long, and it's not trending in a positive direction. Okay. So that's sort of the problem, is how the evolutionary context of the mechanisms are not well tailored to help you master the modern world as it exists for most humans. Okay. So let's talk about how to address that, how to handle it, how to overcome. Okay. And let's go immediate term, cause effect, and then let's get a little bit long term and preventative, and then we'll talk about tracking. Okay. And then we'll talk about making lifestyle changes. So in the immediate sense, you probably need a physical redirection of your sensory triggers to convince your body to relax its stress chemicals. And you need to ventilate the stress chemicals that presently exist if they're above a certain level. Okay. Some amount of these stress chemicals are going to process out through just normal body processes. So urination, tears, sweat, any way that things leave your body, these chemicals get eaten up by enzymes and spit out in a post-chewed up process. And if your stress levels weren't too high, that would be totally sufficient. But what happens is your cortisol, your glutamate, your NMDA, these climb so high and they stay up so long that they cause nerve problems, they cause cognitive problems, they create susceptibility to panic and tension. And then, when they're worn out, your body gets signals to not produce as much when they're actually needed. So then you have people who've been so chronically stressed out that after a point they have chronically low cortisol. So then when it's time to get up and get moving, they can't get that physical push to just escalate and get out the door and conquer their challenges. And that's sort of the major danger if we let this go. In addition to everything else we think about with anxiety, stress, fear, anger, all being problematic, the real problem is when you've burnt off your reward chemistry and you've desensitized your receptor sites to where now you can't activate your get up and go if your life depended on it. And that's when we lead from chronic anxiety to chronic depressive states, which in my view are a lot more detrimental and harder to shake yourself out of than an anxiety state. So if you can catch yourself while you're still stressed out and you can reverse that trend, that's a great way to prevent having to climb out of a deeper hole. Okay. So getting to it, how do you get rid of these stress chemicals? And some of this should be obvious, but what the value is going to be where we go a little bit more specific. Okay. When I tell you that exercise is going to reduce your stress, that anyone with half a brain could tell you that, right? But I want to get specific here, and we're going to use nature as our guide. If you think about stress as a relatively universal set of chemicals, gazelles have it, deer have it. If you are a gazelle and you're being chased by something sharp that's being filmed on National Geographic, you're not going to jog and you're not going to stop to pick up weights, assuming you had opposable thumbs. You're going to sprint at explosive capacity with everything you've got for a brief period of time in the hopes that you escape the predator. Now flip over to if you are the predator, you're not going, there are persistence hunters, but those are usually specialized. They're usually pack hunters, and they're usually in open terrain whereby ambush hunting isn't so viable. But assuming you're not a persistence hunter, and yes, and humans are strange, right? We've been ambush predators as well as persistence predators. We're very adaptable. We have very good cardiovascular systems, but we're also not very fast on two legs. So we can kind of serve both roles. But to optimize your stress response, you want to act as though you are the predator or you are the prey. And in either case, in both of these scenarios, your objective is to explode at full power, full blast for a brief interval. And what this is going to do, psychologically, it's going to trick your brain into thinking, oh, all these chemicals that have been pounding my brain and body were signals to deal with a threat or fear or problem or challenge. clearly by exploding into full high intensity brief duration cardio, I have executed on the warnings, I have jumped at that gazelle, or I've run from that threat. Everything must be okay because warning received and warning acted upon. Okay? So by engaging in high intensity brief duration cardio, you trigger your amygdala and some other states that, hey, he or she got the message and they acted on the message and we're not dead, all is well. And that alone helps. Now, getting a little bit deeper, what's going to happen is as you increase your body temperature through high intensity explosive movement, you increase your heart rate, you're also going to shake loose a chemical cascade that's going to reinforce that message of, okay, message received, message answered. And one famous chemical that's known to flush this process is dynorphin, all right? So the first major tactic you're going to employ to handle short-term anxiety is going to be high intensity, brief duration. And when I say brief duration, it depends on the intensity, but if you're going 90+% max heart rate, full blast, 60 seconds is probably plenty. A couple rounds of that, and you'll find a marked difference in how stressed out you physically feel, okay? So that's the first one, probably the most powerful one, is high intensity, brief duration cardio. And in a similar mechanistic vein, but I would recommend this either as a supplement or if you're experiencing an emergency state, or if you do have access to this where you could regularly engage in a protocol, I would do this in addition to high intensity cardio. But the next one is a sauna protocol. Now, I've seen studies where 120 degrees Fahrenheit is minimum. I've seen some where it's 140 degrees Fahrenheit is minimum. What you're looking to do is the same mechanical process of discomfort leads to escalating of heart rate, which leads to sweating, which leads to perception that warning message received, action taken, warning message answered, and a chemical response, dynorphin again, and some other ones, to tell the body, okay, the proper actions have been taken, initiate the scrubbing protocol to bring this person back to relaxed state where we can reprioritize the parasympathetic nervous system and they can rest and digest rather than fight and flight, okay? Those are the two most powerful chemical manipulators, but you can't always do full blast exercise and you can't always get yourself into a steamy sauna. Also, be aware of your medical conditions for any of these tactics, guys. Common sense. Another thing you can do, which isn't as powerful, but it's often more accessible, is you can try to temporarily bypass the chemical levels and signal the shift of resources from the sympathetic fight-flight nervous system to the parasympathetic relax, rest, digest nervous system. And one indicator that's, or one moving part that you usually have control over, even if you can't exercise, even if you can't sweat in high temperatures, is to manipulate your breathing, okay? Now, if you think about this, breath is an obvious trigger to give instructions to your physical state, right? This is how yogic disciplines, gymnastic disciplines, meditative disciplines often utilize breath to have an effect, okay? And if you are trying to key yourself up, let's say you're sluggish, you're lethargic, you're down, you need to be active, you need to be in fight flight, then you want to signal a rapid pulling of oxygen in, okay? But if you're tense, agitated, stressed, jittery, you want to signal an excess of CO2 going out, all right? And there's any number of protocols to do this, but keeping it very simple, let's just pretend that a normal pattern of breathing is the same amount of inhale to exhale ratio. Usually it's not. Usually people tend to exhale a little too shallow, but let's pretend that you have that about normal, 5 in and 5 out, all right? 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. Let's pretend that you have a healthy breathing pattern. If you're trying to reduce your temporary anxiety, again, this doesn't get rid of the chemistry. You need to handle that. But if you need to sort of get a panic attack under control or cool your nerves or lower your blood pressure or just survive the next couple of hours till you can get somewhere private, then you want your exhale to be twice as long as your inhale. So if I breathe in 5, you want your exhale to be 10. Now, this protocol is not as immediately powerful or as impactful as full blast cardio or as sauna interventions. So you make up for that with a longer duration. All right. You probably need like 10 plus solid minutes, stopwatch, inhale 5, exhale 10, inhale 6, exhale 12, whatever you prefer. And don't count on it to do anything unless you could drop 10 minutes on it with nothing else happening. Okay. And you'll have a secondary benefit of what the Zen Buddhists would call zazen, where you sit and you try to bring as much of your present attention into your breathing as possible. That'll be a secondary benefit. But really, the perception of ventilating CO2 is going to trigger a temporary redirection from the sympathetic nervous system to the parasympathetic nervous system. So I know I'm talking a lot, but to recap, you've got high intensity cardio, brief duration, you've got sauna interventions, and you've got parasympathetic breathing, or breathe out twice as long as breathing in. Okay. Now these are very in the moment, immediate, I feel tense now, what do I do? That should take care of most circumstances. Bear in mind that these are very short-term solutions. You will have to plug them often, and you will have to do that repeatedly until you've cultivated longer-term interventions. Okay, so let's get to the longer-term stuff. If you don't have a longer-term plan, if you don't change your habits or thinking patterns, then you're going to run into this scenario where you're constantly chasing your tail, playing defense. Stress comes up, stress comes down. Stress goes up, stress goes down. And the problem with that is you're doing all this effort to come back to an adequate baseline instead of building an architecture in your nervous system and in your brain that's going to create a sort of preventative buffer to where it's harder to get to that negative state to begin with. Okay? So how do we do that? The first thing is to understand that you need to engage in 50,000 plus repetitions of desensitization to perceptions and thoughts that provoke a ratcheting up of stress levels. Okay? And you can't just rush that. You need to take your time. There are many words for this. There's a systematic desensitization. There's also exposure therapy. One way that I'm a fan of instructing this in my clinical work is to utilize focus attention meditation. And the gist of that is where you do something like a shamatha practice, calm abiding, where you build a script in your mind, such as breathing and counting in a certain way, where your objective over months is to create a longer span of time where no thought interrupts your chosen script. Okay, I'll make separate videos on meditative practice, but that is a great long-term pattern. Start focused attention type meditation category, and that will allow you to buffer yourself against letting future perceptions become an increase in stress chemistry. Okay, so that's one long-term tactic you could start to build upon. I don't have time to get into it today, but that's you could Google shamatha or calm abiding for a good start. Okay, and another thing I would utilize is a series of philosophical exercises called Stoic Practices. Stoicism is a Greco-Roman philosophy that's several thousand years old. I'll make another video on or video series on martial philosophy. We'll get to that another time. But if you need immediate curiosity satisfaction, I would look up Marcus Aurelius. I would look up Seneca. I would look up Epictetus, and look up Zeno. And those should give you good starting points if you just must know what that is right away. But some example Stoic practices are premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of evils, where you sit for a moment and you imagine all of the fear-inducing, annoyance-inducing problems or difficulties or upsets that you might possibly experience in your given day. And you could slice that up or stretch it out to like, okay, in the next week, it's Sunday night, I'm preparing for my week ahead. What problems might I visualize happening to me that I can mentally sort of prepare for the gut punch in advance, okay? Or you can go, okay, I'm about to go into this hour-and-a-half meeting. Who's going to behave like what? What kind of problems are going to come to me? How do I deal? And I'm going to make more detailed videos about that set of techniques. But just know that if you mentally prepare incrementally for your problems before they are perceived, you will find that there is less of a shock value and there's less of a chemical response over time, which makes it easier to manage with those physical techniques that we talked about a couple of minutes ago. All right. So we've covered the nature of anxiety. We've covered the misconceptions about it being a problem with the person rather than a problem with their habits and their environment. We've covered the industrial escalation of anxiety and stress due to long-term archival tracking and longer-term windows where you can't immediately solve acute anxiety with acute. You can't solve chronic problems with acute actions. We talked about short-term relief tactics. We talked about long-term preparation to desensitize to future problems. Let's also talk about how to track and how to observe. Okay. Emotions are they're not really perceived so much in the immediate headspace. They're perceived in the physicality, in the physical susceptibility, and the physical perception. So one thing I would encourage, and you could call this mindfulness practice, you could call this journaling, you can call this checking in, there's endless words for it, but at some point where you have regular downtime, either beginning of day, end of day, lunch break, in between meetings, what have you, pay attention to the sensors in your body, right? Do you have a headache? Is your mouth dry? Is your stomach in knots? Are you clammy? Are you sweaty? Are you jittery? Are your muscles knotted up? Do you feel the need to twist, right? Do you feel tight? These sorts of signs will tell you, okay, this is a body that is being given an anxiety dose. It's being given chronic or acute stress response chemicals. And that will tell you that you haven't leveled yourself off to a positive parasympathetic baseline, okay? So let's say that you discover that and it's like, oh no, I'm not in a good place. I'm starting to feel anxious. If you don't practice that cultivation, by the time you're aware of it, it will be a far stronger sensation, far more difficult to bring back down. But let's say you cultivate awareness. You're like, okay, I'm starting to get stressed out. Now you would plug one of those immediate tactics. If feasible, go take a lunch break and go hit a sprint if you have clothes or whatever, burpees, something like that. If you have a sauna in a nearby gym, awesome. But for most people, if you're in the middle of your day or you don't have the time available to go engage in high intensity cardio or sauna use, then you could just, all right, let me shut off communication devices, step away from my screen, sit down for 10 minutes, hit the stopwatch on my phone, and practice parasympathetic breathing, okay? Another thing is if you write this observation pattern down, and I would say the shorter the better because that could give you a quick way to track long-term trends. If you write this down and you regularly track it, you're going to be able to figure out the correlation and match the trend between, all right, I've started doing these intervention tactics, I've been made more aware, I've made some lifestyle tweaks. How well is it working? Okay. And if you've done all of this semi-rigorously, you've regularly paid attention to how you're experiencing tension, stress, fear, panic, challenge, threat. You're engaging in breath work, you're engaging in exercise, you're engaging in sauna interventions, you're engaging in desensitization cognitive techniques of some form. And in a couple of months, if you're not experiencing a general improvement and there's no outside event that got drastically more difficult to justify it, that's when I would look into pharmacological interventions. That's when I would look into getting a full workup and evaluation to make sure you don't have any medical concerns, hormone concerns, or to make sure that you don't have some sort of neurological disorder that might require pharmacology, okay? But I think the vast majority of people who take some kind of chemical exogenous intervention haven't done the identification and action steps to gain command of it before they run to the outside world to dampen the problem, okay? I know this is a long video. I hope we covered some useful information. And if you have any questions about this stuff, just shoot me an email or drop it in the comments and I'll do my best to get back to you. And I'm going to make more deep dive videos like this about depressive states, manic states, cognitive detachment exercises, meditative practices, martial philosophy such as Stoicism, Zazen, these sorts of things. But yeah, thank you guys for your time, and I hope you found this useful.